Өзіңіз құясыз, иә?
Мгм.
Ау.
Иә. Енді қорқып ба?
Жоқ. Сау.
Сау.
Түшкірік басталды, түшкірік.
Енді ішесің бе құяйын ба?
Ішім ауырып кетті.
Ішесің ба? Оқпа.
Тышсам қайтесіз.
А,
Тышсам қайтесіз.
жеймін ғой. Жеймін бе? А, оғыңа жеп алайын ба? Tamam.
Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Good morning.
Good. Good morning, everybody. So we can start today's class going on with the history. So I'm going to share the screen. We're going back. Mm. Okay. Okay, so we were talking yesterday, remember, the first direct election of the European Parliament, which was in 1979, and which gave momentum to the effort of democratization of the process of European integration, which was a little bit weak up to that moment. Since the institutions and the procedures had been conceived for more, we can say, kind of administrative process. So yes, there were the decisions that had to be implemented and enforced directly within the member states, as we said. But at the same time, you know, the original idea was that this transfer of sovereignty and of competence from the member state to the common institutions was to be, you know, limited to very technical and economic sectors, as it was with the European Coal and Steel Community. With the EEC, the things started to change because the common market, as we said, was much wider in scope, because the common market involved also elements that affected directly the position of the citizens, not only the free movement of goods that, you know, was related to trade among the member states, but particularly the free movement of persons, creating rights and obligations for workers, for service providers, and so on, for customers, consumers, farmers, when we talk about the agricultural policy, but also, you know, all kind of economic activities were being affected by the EEC treaty. And as a consequence, all those persons that were active in those economic activities. For this reason, and you know, as we said before, the principles of the rule of law were deeply rooted in the idea, in Schumann's idea of integration. But his idea was limited to the necessity of creating a judicial review of the legality of the acts that were being adopted, that were going to be adopted by the higher authority. Remember, no? The fact that there had to be some kind of body to which those who were interested could appeal in order to carry out the judicial review of the legality of the acts from the point of view of the treaties, of the structure of the treaty. But at this point, that was not enough. So a strict provision for the legality of the acts was not sufficient to guarantee the rule of law in the communities. was the need for a more democratic approach also to the lawmaking process. Okay, so it was not sufficient to have supranational institutions which were independent, appointed by the government, together with another body which had, let's say, legislative powers, decision-making powers, which was and still is the council, which is composed, as we will see, by the governments again. It was not sufficient to guarantee respect of the rule of law from the point of view of the democratic principle, which was, as is today, at the basis of the legal orders of all the member states. And in the direct election of the European Parliament goes precisely in that direction. So to improve the democratic, the democratic life of European integration. But it was just a first step, as you can imagine, because the European Parliament, as I told you yesterday, was only a consultative body. So its opinions during the legislative procedure were not binding, which means that the Council, and for what of its competence, the Commission could decide against the opinion of the Parliament. This is the point. This was a consultation procedure that was in force at that time. And if this is the picture, of 1979, so after the election, the European Parliament starts working, the new European Parliament, strong of the popular and democratic legitimacy and the power of representation of the citizens for the first time in history. It's the first time that an international body, an international parliamentary body, is directly elected by the citizens in the framework of international organizations. So it's a big thing. Now we got used to that, and we even underestimate, and we do not confer so much of importance to the European Parliament. But believe me, it's a big thing in the framework of international organizations. And at that time, it was felt very strongly, particularly by the members of the European Parliament, who felt this responsibility, but also this new power that came from democratic legitimacy. So they started working in the direction of building upon this momentum that came from the election in order to change the rules of the communities. And so here we have, we can say, parallel activity of the Commission, which came a few years later, the new Commission, the Jacques Delors Commission, which was appointed, I think, in 1984, something like that. While the European Parliament was working immediately after the election on a project for a new treaty, because the Parliament, under the leadership of Altiero Spinelli and other federalists in the Parliament, felt that as a new Parliament directly elected by universal suffrage by the peoples of the community, they had the role and the legitimacy to be entitled to write a new constitution for a European federation or a European Union. A European Union which tended to be a federal union. So they worked on that. They worked on that, on a new treaty that had to be decided by the Parliament and possibly approved by the Parliament. So avoiding or sidestepping the moment of national ratification. So changing completely the approach to European integration, not an international process of treaty making, ratification, and so on, where the states are the masters of the treaties, so those who decide what to do and what not to do, but the parliament and the peoples. So this means that it is not anymore an international process, but a constitutional one. Anyway, the parliament wrote this project, which is now known as Progetto Spinelli, Spinelli project, because he was the most prominent figure in that process, which is a very innovative project. You can find the text if you want. I can upload on Moodle for you to read, and it'd be interesting to compare that project to subsequent solutions that were adopted in the years to come for some issues of European integration, like political cooperation and the role of the heads of state and government and the role of the parliament. Because although at that time, so we are in the first years of the 80s, the member states were absolutely not ready to accept such an innovative, such a federal, if you want, solution. Although the Spinelli project did not foresee or put in place or establish a federation in the sense of a state, of a federal state, but it was still a union, so maybe more a confederal system where how can I say, the role and the individuality of the individual member states remained. They were not extinguished as subjects of international law. So it was still a kind of hybrid subject. But nevertheless, it was too advanced for the states to accept. So it was put aside by the member states. But it was nevertheless a very important step, because it made the states, but also the new commission, as we said, the Jacques Delors Commission, consider and realize that it was the moment, it was the time to get to work in order to modify, to amend, to reform the existing treaties. Also because after the decade of the 70s, that was a decade of crisis, where, as I said yesterday, the communities risked collapsing. It was necessary to start again, to give, the feeling of a new start of European integration. And this is what happened with the European Single Act, which was concluded in 1986 and entered into force the following year in 1987. What is the European Single Act? The European Single Act is the first major revision treaty of the process, in the process of European integration. So just 1 second to explain what a revision treaty is, because it's the process by which European integration has evolved. On the basis of the founding treaties, which are the Paris and especially the Rome Treaty of 1957. So if you look now, today, at the treaties that are currently in force, the basis of those treaties is still the text of the Rome Treaties in 1957. This is the idea. Those basic treaties were, of course, changed, were modified, pieces were added here and there, text of some articles has been changed, but the core, the structure of the treaties has remained the same. So the idea here is that there is a line that starts in 1951 then of course has a big improvement in 1957, and that follows step by step the same line with things that were added, things that were changed, things that were removed also, but basically that's the same line of continuity from the first to the last. And this is important because, as we will see, at a certain point, the member states tried to interrupt, to cut that line, but it didn't succeed. We will see when and how. So we were in first half of the 80s. Spinelli was discussing his project in the parliament. Meanwhile, the new commission was established, and seeing that it was very hard to consider, to imagine that the Spinelli project could be approved, Delors, who was another important figure in European integration, he was also one of those who favored, who promoted the monetary union for Europe. So he was very active in promoting European integration. He decided that there was the need to maintain the momentum that had started in 1979 with the election, and to allow European integration to move a few steps ahead, forward. And the slogan, we can say, for this process, for this idea, was to complete the common market. The common market, so the abolition and the removal of all barriers to trade and to the free movement of goods, capitals, persons, and services among the member states, had been started in the 60s. At the end of the 60s, it was almost accomplished. Then in the 70s, there was the crisis. And at the beginning of the 80s, there still were many residual barriers, residual problems and obstacles to the free movement. So what Delors said, also for the public opinion, to bring interest in the public opinion, was that this new revision treaty would help remove the residual barriers to the common market by accomplishing, new competencies for policies necessary for the common market that were not considered before, like the most important of which was the environmental policy that started here with the European Single Act. Environmental policy, which was not considered because in the 50s probably there was not this sensibility for the environment, and which was introduced in the 80s, probably because there was certainly a starting sincere concern for the environment, and also because the European community had, the environment is a problem. The protection of the environment is a problem that is transboundary. So you cannot approach the environmental problem without considering its international dimension, And because pollution and all other problems, climate change and all this, do not consider boundaries. So the first measures that have been adopted by the EC before the European Single Act for environmental protection were international agreements. And theoretically, the European community was not competent to enter into international agreements on subjects that were not part of its competence. So it was a bit of a problem. They had to use some clauses in the treaty that allowed to expand the powers. We will see how that works. But there was the need for the EC to be able to do that and also to adopt internal measures on the environment. Why? Because there was concern for the environment, because the individual states could not unilaterally address and effectively address the environmental problem, but also because environmental standards are a very important possible cause of distortion in the market, distortion of competition, of trade, because they are expensive, they're costly. So there can be a dumping, an environmental dumping, by which companies, undertakings, regions, states can try to lower their costs and consequently their prices by lowering their environmental standards. But on the contrary, states that are more sensible towards environmental problem may raise the standards, but also their costs. So more pragmatically, the Commission, the law, considered environmental policy not only an important, concern for the member states and the community as a whole, but also the need for common environmental standards, at least the minimum standards, was necessary for the common market, for maintaining a balance in the common market. And this is the same for many others. So you will see one of the chapters in your book and in our course is about harmonization. Harmonization of all, apart from the environment that has its own policy, because it started growing as a problem, growing as an issue, and now it is one of the biggest policies of the European Union. It is cross-cutting and integrated in all other activities. So that's one thing. But in general, the harmonization of technical, sanitary, phytosanitary, safety standards is one of the most important elements for achieving the uniform functioning of the common market. And this is true, of course, for the internal market of the Union, but it's true in general in international trade. Okay. And this is something on which we will have to discuss a little bit more in detail later. But okay, consider the internal market. All, we can say, legal and monetary barriers had been already abolished to the free movement of goods. So there were no quantitative restrictions, no customs duties for the movement of goods among the member states. Okay, so you would say, perfect, no barriers left, there is free movement. But barriers can be hidden somewhere else. And when we will study the free movement of goods, this will be very clear. Barriers can be hidden where? In regulations, state regulations that apparently are adopted in order to regulate the marketing of a certain product on the internal market of the state. But in substance, they also affect trade with other member states by limiting or making it impossible for the foreign, the imported product to be placed on the market in the state. One example is one of the most famous case in this framework is the so-called Cassis de Dijon case, which we will read, where basically a German regulation on the alcohol level of beverages made it impossible for French producers to place this Cassis de Dijon, which is a liquor but has a very low alcoholic content, on the German market, because it was not consistent, it did not comply with German requirements about alcoholic beverages. So you see that this looked like a very innocuous and, non-discriminatory regulation, but its effect was to limit the trade between the two countries. So, going back to the European Single Act, the law, of course, and the member states, because this was, but the law's proposals for completing the common market were, on the one hand, introducing new policies, among which environmental policy. On the other hand, increasing the harmonization power of the communities in the field of trade regulations, like safety standards. Consider all the huge number of directives that harmonize safety criteria for machinery, for toys, for industrial products. I was recently looking for, I need to buy a window, no? A window that is one with the saliscendi, guillotine, I don't know how to say, which is not certified all over Europe if it does not comply with safety standards that have been established by the EU with a directive. And this happens with a whole enormous range of products. Okay, health criteria for food, for beverages, and so on and so forth, in order to avoid that different standards might create distortions or barriers to the internal trade. So, completion of the common market through these two approaches, expansion of the harmonization competence on the one hand, which we will see now, it's Article 114 and 15 of the treaties, and on the other hand, introduction of new competencies connected to the free movement inside the common market. Then there is another important achievement with the European Single Act, which is, or better, two, which are connected to the rule of law principle. And the first one is the provision for the introduction of a second level of jurisdiction. So, with the original treaties, there was only one judicial body, which was the Court of Justice. And the decisions, the judgments of the Court of Justice were final, so with a single level of jurisdiction. There was no possibility of appeal against the decisions of the Court of Justice. Okay, are you following? You know the principle of a double level of jurisdiction, that is a guarantee for the citizens that the case will be heard by different judges. That the first decision should be reviewed in a second level of jurisdiction by a different judge. This principle, which is also enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights, was not respected by the original treaties. So there was the need to introduce a new level of jurisdiction. In addition to that, after the first years where, the Court of Justice did not work very much because, there were new mechanisms that the citizens and domestic courts were not familiar with this new jurisdiction. But after number of years, this all started to increase, and the Court of Justice had a lot of work. The case load was larger, and the second problem was that the length of the cases was excessive, no? To have a judgment, the interested parties needed to wait years in some cases. So there were these two needs: to respect the principle of rule of law, the double level of jurisdiction on one hand, and on the other to ease the caseload of the Court of Justice, and again respecting the principle of the how can I say, of equitable length of proceedings. So the European Single Act provides for the establishment of another court, which was called at the time Court of First Instance, precisely to show that it was the first level of jurisdiction. So the Court of Justice moved to the highest level, becoming a sort of court of appeal. In reality, the distribution of competencies between the two, it's a little much more articulated than that, but we are going to study a Court of Justice and better understand this. Anyway, this is the general idea. Now, this Court of First Instance is called General Court, because in theory there can be courts that are even lower than the general court, that should be the specialized courts, but for the moment no one has been established. Okay, so completion of the common market, establishment, and the second issue, respect for principles of rule of law. First, establishment of a second level of jurisdiction, and second point in the rule of law, we can say, concerns of the European Single Act is the expansion of the powers of the European Parliament, which started acquiring some, although yet limited, decisional powers in the legislative process. Precisely in this treaty, the new co-decision procedure was introduced. As I said before, the normal procedure was a consultation procedure. So the Commission had the right of initiative, so prepared the proposal of an act, and the Council decided after consulting the Parliament. But the opinion of the Parliament was mandatory, so that the Council had to ask, to request the opinion, but the opinion was not binding. So the Council could decide also in contrast with the Parliament's opinion. Now, this new procedure that was introduced is the co-decision procedure, by which the Parliament has so the act can be adopted only if Council and Parliament agree on a text. So the Parliament has exactly the same role as the Parliament has exactly the same role as the Council in the decision-making process. So, yes.
Could you repeat this last part, please?
On the co-decision, okay, the co-decision means that they decide together. So, for the first time, the European Parliament acquires a full decision-making power, by which it is placed on the same equal footing with the Council. So the co-decision procedure works that the Commission, again, has the initiative, so prepares, drafts a proposal of a text of an act, and then the European Parliament and Council must find an agreement on the text. So they can both submit amendments and changes, but then they have to sign the same text. And if the Parliament does not agree, the text cannot be adopted. Co-decision, they decide together. Now, but at the time of the European Single Act, this was a new procedure that only applied to a limited set of cases, of policies. It was not generally applied. So they were both co-decision and consultation procedures in the treaties. Now, after the Lisbon Treaty, the co-decision procedure is now called ordinary legislative procedure, and it is the ordinary legislative procedure. So it is the procedure that is normally used for the adoption of legislative acts. So since the 1958, where the Parliament was only a consultative body, now the Parliament is a full co-legislator in the Union. There are still limitations for number of also important things, but in general, this is the rule. So the introduction of the co-decision procedure is, of course, an important step towards the democratization of the European communities, in general, political process. But it was not enough, of course. So now we will see how it further developed in the future. Okay, this said, for the, we can say, community part of the European Single Act, there is something to say for the other part of this act, because it is strange. This name is strange, no? What does European Single Act mean? Why single act? It's an agreement. It's a revision agreement. What is the meaning of this strange name? Well, it derives from the fact that another big issue that had emerged in the 70s after with the crisis that had affected, the international community and also Europe directly, like the problem of the energy, Middle East, monetary. So issues of international politics had created, had made the differences of vision in foreign policy among the member states. They were not able to have a unitary position towards international crisis that affected the international community. So the problem is that the communities were starting to build an important economic and trade subject with an important role also in international trade, international economic relations. But when it came to the discussion of political issues, political questions, they were not able to, to determine their common position or their common, attitude towards these problems. Since the 70s, the states had started to imagine, to put in place possible, procedures in order to at least consult and discuss on international politics. But, nothing particularly important had been agreed, and particularly nothing binding for them. So the second, we can say, part of the conference, of the international conference that led to the European Single Act, was devoted to the political cooperation, European political cooperation, to the idea of creating another block of integration, or at least attempted integration in foreign policy. So originally the idea was to conclude two different treaties, one on the economic part and the revision of the existing treaties, and another one on political cooperation, which should be somehow separated from community integration. In the end, it was decided to put the results of both parts of the conference together, and this is why European Single Act. So it is a single act, but which is composed of two very different parts. The first part is the revision of the treaties, where you find a language that is very community language, member states, legislative process, the institutions, the parliament, and so on, the competencies, the policies, no? It's the community language. The political part is, on the contrary, very diplomatic, also in the languages. So you find the high contracting parties instead of the member states. You find that the meetings of the ministers of foreign affairs are meetings of the ministers and not the council of the communities where the ministers meet normally. But, you know, in order not to make a confusion between the two, they had to make it clear whether they were meeting the same persons, whether they were meeting as a council of the communities or as meeting of the ministers of foreign affairs in the field of political cooperation. So they put a lot of efforts in keeping the two areas separated. One thing is economic integration, which is supranational and has all the rule of law characters that we have tried to explain. And the other part is political cooperation, which is not supranational, which is an intergovernmental diplomatic cooperation and nothing more. Okay, but the effort was to put in place like a structure with procedures, with automatic procedure, meaning that if a state or if something happened in the international sphere, they had to meet, so at least they were somehow forced to sit together in the same room and discuss. But of course, there was no obligation to reach a consensus. Also, because in that framework of political cooperation, they were all decisions were taken. Were taken by unanimity. Oh my God, who is this? Sorry. Forgive me. I always forget. So unanimity, and this mention of unanimity makes me think of another important achievement of the European Single Act, which is the fact that in the community part, so completion of the common market, one other element that went together with the expansion of the powers of the parliament was the how can I say, not the abolition, but the reduction of the cases where the council could decide by unanimity. So the affirmation of majority voting in the council, which is another element of the supranational character of the communities, because in international law, in international organizations, normally the institutions, the bodies where the states, the member states of the organization sit, are decided by unanimity, by agreement. So a state, this is a general, old, well-known principle of international law, a state is not bound by any obligation he has not accepted. Okay, he has not consented to. And the fact that the majority voting in the council was introduced in the treaties from the very beginning, but then, it was postponed. Its application was postponed by a series of compromises in order to avoid passing to this new rule. In the end, it was finally accepted with a European Single Act, although not for all cases, but for the great majority of cases of policies. Now it is the rule. Now majority is the rule and unanimity is the exception. At the time, maybe it was the contrary, but majority was starting to be affirmed. Majority means that there will be a minority, so that a number of states, of member states, will be bound by a measure they did not accept. They voted against. So you understand that this is an important, step forward in integration. Although, in the procedures, in the practical procedures of the life of the institutions, there are always ways to avoid formal vote and put someone in minority. It happens, of course, but normally there are all procedures why there are discussions, there are compromises, there are negotiations. So the legislative process in the EU is very, very complicated for all these reasons. But anyway, majority principle was also affirmed. And then, while in the political cooperation, which we said is separated, is a different part of the treaty, there is the rule of unanimity. And there is a separation between the institutions of the communities and the procedures of the political cooperation. Consider also that, for example, the institutions used to meet, and they still meet in the council in Brussels, no? Where there are the headquarters of the council and the commission and the other institutions. Okay, Brussels. So imagine meeting of the Council of Foreign Affairs for discussing, I don't know, trade issues in Brussels in the morning. They are the ministers of foreign affairs. Then they have to meet same persons to discuss some political issue. Well, they move, they go to some other capital. For example, they go to Rome or somewhere, or to Paris, and they held their meeting as a meeting of the foreign ministers of the member states, because they could not even meet in the same room, because that could evoke in the public opinion or in the governments the idea that it was a council meeting. So they had to show that it was another thing. So they all together took a plane or a train and went to Paris or somewhere else and held their own meeting. This to show you how paranoid they were in keeping the separation between the two areas. Why? Well, because basically it's clear that economic integration was a transfer of competence in most areas that are the object of European integration. And the member states wanted to keep hold of their sovereignty on all matters that relate to foreign policy. So they accepted the idea of coordinating, but they did not accept the idea of integrating. Also because then foreign policy brings together security issues, defense issue, military things, and so on, which was not acceptable by the member states. So that's the core of sovereignty. Then we will speak about the foreign policy of the European Union as a whole thing, but that's another topic that we will address in another moment. But to conclude on the European Single Act, I would like to say that this separation between economic integration and political cooperation remained even in the following years. And in some ways it is still present today, because still today, well, we will see we have quite complete unification of the system. The title, which is the chapter of the treaty on common foreign security policy and common defense policy, is separated from the rest of the treaties. It is part of the Treaty on the European Union where with a very different regime, different rules with respect to all the other policies of the Union. And it is still governed by intergovernmental cooperation method rather than supranational method. So this is still present, although procedures have improved and competencies also have improved and many achievements have been realized. But still, in the big crisis, the European Union has a lot of difficulties in handling them together, as it has demonstrated over and over again. So, between 1987 and 1993, which are the dates of entry into force of the European Single Act and of the Maastricht Treaty, which is the subsequent revision of the treaties, a lot of important things happened that affected the history of Europe and of the world, we can say. What happened in those crucial years for the world history?
They followed the Berlin Wall.
Yes, we already analyzed this part of history talking about the enlargement process. So the fall of the Berlin Wall, the unification of Germany, and the transition of the Central and Eastern European states from socialist regimes to democratic and to accession to the communities. All this made it necessary to attempt a further revision of the treaties in order to achieve a reform of the institutions that were conceived for working with 6 members, and that now had to work with, in perspective, with 25, 26, 28. So, sorry. Are there any vendors for water around here? As far as you know, the machines, the vending machines? No, not on this floor. Today I forgot to bring water again. Anyway, okay. So there was a need to attempt a reform of the institutions in order to make them more effective with the new membership. And also in order to comply with those conditions that the the world powers had put on and France also had put on the reunification of Germany in order not to start again, to trigger again the concern for the excessive power of a unified Germany. And these conditions were that the reunification of Germany had to happen in the framework of a stronger European Union. So it was the European Union, how can we say, the golden cage within which that would provide the constraints for all temptation of hegemony of Germany on the European scene. And this especially from the point of view of foreign policy, of course. So the political and defense cooperation had to be strengthened together with the functioning of the institutions, the effectiveness of the work of the institutions, and in general, European integration. So here negotiations were started, and the result, which is a very important result, but at least not completely satisfactory from the point of view of the institutional reform, was the Treaty on the European Union at Maastricht. And now I need to open another online. Can you see that? But you can't see anything here. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't even look. Oh my, oh my, oh my. I'm really distracted. Really sorry about that. But anyway, it was nothing important. But this is no, they were just the dates of the treaties. So nothing important. Let me see if now we are able to show you the Greek temple of the Maastricht Treaty. No, nothing happens. Really, I'm really, really so sorry. Well, what's going on? It's on. The projector is on. Can you see it on your laptops?
No, unfortunately, I cannot log in into the Wi-Fi at Sapient, so I don't know why.
Ah. Okay, now it's green. Okay. Yes. Okay. Wow, yes. Okay, yes, but maybe we should turn the light off because we cannot see. Ah, now it's nice. Now this is nice. Okay, so this is one of the many architectural structures that have been imagined to draw the structure of the Maastricht Treaty, but probably it's the most effective. the image is that of a Greek temple. But let's see, what is the Maastricht Treaty? So the Maastricht Treaty is another one of those revision treaties that I explained before. So we are following that red line, and this is another revision, so another modification and amendment of the EEC treaty and of the other communities. But there is something new. So it's a revision treaty of the original treaties, but there is also a new treaty. And the new treaty is the Treaty on the European Union. So with Maastricht, the Maastricht Treaty is a very complex treaty. Again, as in the Single European Act, there are two parts. A part with the revision and reform of the community treaties.
Yes, sir.
And another part with the other areas of cooperation that have been introduced and amended and modified. For example, the political cooperation, which is based on the Single European Act, but again, with an evolution, with amendments. In addition to this, the Treaty on the European Union has, with the Maastricht Treaty, the general principles and general provisions that were the beginning of the EC Treaty have been moved to the Treaty on the European Union, and the same happened with the final provisions. Final provisions are those that provide for accession of new members, for entry into force, for the revision, all these kind of things. While the general provision, the introductory provisions, are those who give the values, the principles, the objectives of the treaty, and also, you know, the institutions, the introduction to the institutions, this kind of stuff. By moving these two parts, so introductory, general provisions, and final, from the Treaty on the European Community to the Treaty on the European Union, the idea was to say that all these treaties, Treaty on the European Union, Treaty on the European Community, Treaty on the Economy, on the European Coal and Steel Community, and Treaty on the Euratom, have the same institutions, single institutional framework. This was the principle. And they share the objectives, and they share the principles, and they share also the final provisions. So, for example, this means that a candidate country, so the membership, in order to achieve membership, a state must become member of the European Union and of the European Community. So they are a single block that comprises them all. Are you following? This is a little bit complicated from the legal architecture, we can say. But anyway, this is it. This is the structure. The European Economic Community loses one E, which is economic, because with the expansion of powers to other areas of integration, like culture, like industry, and so on, it is more than economic. So it is European Community. And the Treaty on the European Union is created anew on the basis of the previous second part of the European Single Act. And we have this structure that you see here. So we have a Greek temple with 3 pillars. The first pillar is composed of the European communities. So the 3 treaties of the European communities constitute the first pillar. The second pillar is the common foreign and security policy. So it's another field of cooperation. The second pillar is not supranational, it's still intergovernmental. The third pillar is justice and home affairs or police cooperation, judicial cooperation, which is an area of cooperation that before was conducted basically outside the scope of the treaties, and then it is included in this structure. But at that time, judicial cooperation and police cooperation were still intergovernmental, mostly intergovernmental. So there were forms of cooperation, the possibility to adopt acts that had the objective of introducing some common standards for the mutual recognition of judicial decisions on the one hand, and on the other, the establishment of Europol as the police office of the European Union for conducting joint investigations into transboundary crimes like, terrorism or drugs trafficking and all these crimes that are transnational in their essence, organized crime and so on. So these are the three pillars which correspond to different, well, the treaties on the communities are independent somehow, while the second and third pillar correspond to chapters of the Treaty on the European Union. The superior part, the roof of the temple, is composed of the introductory and general provisions. You see that are common to the three pillars and that are applicable to the three sectors of cooperation. And the same happens for the for the steps here, the base of the temple, which is represents the final provision. So the final provisions on accession, entry into force, modification, and so on are also common to the three pillars. What is the problem with the Maastricht Treaty? The problem with the Maastricht Treaty is that it establishes a European Union, but the European Union basically is lives together in this structure with the communities, which are also subjects of international law. So they have their own individuality, their own subjectivity, the communities. And then there is this new subject, the European Union. And from the point of view of reciprocal relations, competencies, and also from the point of view of relations with third countries, it was not clear who was competent to do what. And the third states, if they wanted to start relations with the European Union, they didn't know who to call. So it was a compromise, as it often happens with the European integration, but it was not very satisfactory for this reason, because it created a very complicated structure. You see how difficult it is also to explain it. And there was the need to create, to paint it, to make a drawing in order to explain how it works. And really, it was not a linear structure. It was a very complicated structure. So immediately after the entry into force of the Maastricht Treaty, the process of trying to simplify the structure started immediately after that. This is
Professor.
another picture that follows the same pattern of the Greek temple, you see, with the common provisions and final provisions on the
Professor.
base, and then the first pillar, second and third pillars. And there was the need to dismantle these pillars and to build a unitary structure for the European Union. In the meanwhile, let's go back here. There were, so the process of reforming the treaties continued with these two subsequent treaties, the Treaty of Amsterdam and the Treaty of Nice, 1999, well, 1997 actually the signing, and 2000 for the Treaty of Nice. Again, here it gives the date of entry into force. Well, they're not very remarkable, but for a couple of elements that I will immediately tell you, which are for the Treaty of Amsterdam, the notion of enhanced cooperation. Enhanced cooperation. What is an enhanced cooperation? It is, okay, remember the context of all this. The perspective of having a huge number of new members, with the concern by some members that integration would be diluted with a huge number of new members, right? Because it would be much more difficult to find the right majorities to bring forward integration if so large a number of member states have to be involved in the integration process. So one of the solutions that were prospected in order to avoid the dilution of integration with expansion of membership was to differentiate integration. So to have a differentiated integration. The fact that some member states could go forward in the integration without all the others, leaving outside of the new endeavors those states that were either unwilling or unable to take part in it. This idea of differentiated integration was not new in the process of European integration, because there are a couple of other important sectors in which this had already been achieved. And this had happened first in 1985 with the famous Schengen Agreement. Schengen Agreement was an agreement that was adopted in Schengen, the city of Schengen, in 1985 precisely, among a limited number of member states. The idea of the Schengen Treaty was that it was a treaty that affected European integration, but was adopted outside the framework of the structure of the treaty, so of the effective, of the actual European integration. So it was something outside, okay? And that which did not include all the members. Only in the following years, the number of states that have been involved in the Schengen system has increased. But in the first the first conclusion of this treaty was a limited number of states. Italy also joined later. What was the idea of Schengen? The idea of Schengen was to basically apply the principle of the customs union, so of the abolition of all border control on goods and establishment of common controls on the external borders, to the free movement of persons. So with Schengen, basically those states that were members, and also now that are members of Schengen, and still they are not all of the member states, among these members of Schengen, all border controls on persons crossing the borders are abolished. No, this is a very visible element of European integration, because all citizens have the opportunity to cross internal borders without having to show their passport. No, this is true for land borders, where you can drive along and you don't even notice the border anymore, just because you see the different the sign that shows you that you're passing from one state to another, but no one stops you. And it happens also on air borders, so in airports. It happens the same, because you can pass at the border control without being checked, or with very limited identity checks. To balance this
Sorry, Professor.
abolition of border controls on persons, according to the Schengen system, have to be moved to the external borders.
Sorry, Professor.
With
Can I
a
ask you a
system, an
question?
integrated system of information on the individuals that cross the borders. This integrated system is a database of those who are, for any reason, unwanted, or wanted by police, or considered dangerous, or people who should not be allowed into the territory of the European Union, or even if they can be allowed, that have to be kept somehow under control, whose movements have to be kept under control. So that when on the external borders a name raises a red flag in the database, measures can be taken to take care of that. This is not something that works very, very well.
Professor.
Also because
Hello.
some states like
Professor.
Italy was very late in connecting to this integrated system, and it created a lot of technical problems and so on. Anyway, Schengen is a very important achievement for the reasons that I was telling you, and it was also the first important example of a differentiated integration. And it was also the first important example of an outside initiative among the member states, outside the framework of the treaties. In fact, and I conclude on Schengen, with the Treaty of Amsterdam in 1999, which introduced the enhanced cooperation, Schengen was finally included in the treaties. So there was this fusion between the external Schengen system, it's the so-called Schengen acquis, what had been acquired through the implementation of the Schengen Agreement. There was a Schengen Execution Convention and so on, a lot of other measures. All this block of regulation regarding Schengen were introduced in the treaties through the Amsterdam Treaty as an enhanced cooperation, because in 1999 still there were many states that had not agreed to Schengen. Okay, so it was a differentiated integration. And the treaty also introduced, the Amsterdam Treaty, a general procedure for establishing enhanced cooperations. So for permitting member states, a group of member states, to start to adopt measures of integration without the participation of all the member states. It introduces a lot of conditions that no new policies can be started in that way, but that the initiative has to be adopted in the framework of an existing policy, that the member states that are that the enhanced cooperation must be always open to all the member states that have been first excluded. If they change their mind, they must be able to get in, and so on. A lot of conditions and procedures. On this aspect of differentiated cooperation, I can tell you that the enhanced cooperation as an instrument was not very successful. Actually, there were a couple of, I took note here of the few cases of enhanced cooperation that have been adopted after that, which is an act in 2010 on the choice of applicable law in case of divorce, if the two spouses are of different nationality. So it is a case of private international law. Then in 2013, an act on patent protection in the European Union. And this is an important act about intellectual property rights. And then another important development was the act establishing the European Public Prosecutor Office, an act that is in force since June 2021, so June of this year, which has established the public prosecutor of the European Union with, so it's criminal cooperation in criminal matters, criminal law. The EPPO has will have, because the act entered into force, but the office has yet to be established and start its function. It will have the power to prosecute also before domestic courts cases of fraud and all cases of crimes that affect the financial interests of the EU, in order to protect the financial interests. These are the only cases of enhanced cooperation that have been adopted so far. So it was not very successful, we can say, but useful in a sort, because it's, the enhanced cooperation has always been used, as a threat against those who were against something. Where, a block of states say, okay, if you do not agree, we do an enhanced cooperation, and we do it anyway. And this was, a pressure to those member states that were hesitant to join, because it's better to be part of new forms of cooperation rather than to be left outside, to be excluded. So apart from the three cases that I told you, were probably, especially in the case of patents and the EPPO, those who did not participate were concerned about the domestic, the impact of these acts on the domestic functioning of the patent protection on one side and of the criminal justice on the other. But normally it is an effective way of pressure, saying, okay, we don't care. If you don't join, we go our way. So it has had its important function of a deterrent, we can say. And let's not forget that one of the most visible and most important and tangible achievements of EU integration is indeed differentiated integration, which is the monetary union. Not all the member states of the EU have the euro, but only a number of them. And again, here there is a different treatment for some states that enjoy of opting out rights that they negotiated at the time of the entry into force of Maastricht Treaty, because it is the Maastricht Treaty that introduced the monetary union, and other states that that are not, we can say, compliant with the economic requirement of the Maastricht Treaty for joining the monetary union. So that is also another case of differentiated integration. Okay, going back, it's all clear because I'm continuing to speak and you never interrupt me. You didn't even tell me that I didn't turn the projector on. This is crazy. Anyway, really, are you finding everything clear?
Yes.
Also, those of you who are online?
No, ma'am.
Okay. I'm going
Hello.
to finish today with the Treaty of Nice, because the Treaty of Nice is really unremarkable, and I will say nothing about the Treaty of Nice, but for one thing that is on the contrary, yes.
I think there are some questions online.
Really? And why didn't you tell me? I guess they are on the chat. I think there are some questions. No, how can I go back to the... Chat. Wow, 64. Oh my God. Why did... Turn on the speaker because you can't hear us. Why? How come?
Excuse me, Professor.
What does it mean, turn
All
on the
these
speaker?
slides were stopped for us during the class.
No, No. Se noi parliamo non c'è... Ok, I understand that, but how can... Interrompi condivisione. Ok. Maybe the colleague who was teaching before, he did that, because I didn't. No, this is my audio. Does someone of you know how can I turn the audio again? So this is just my audio. Microphone, impostazioni audio. No. No, this is just mine. Where? No, because they say that it is disactivated. Registra, trascrizione, nascondi sotto le visualizzazioni.
Prof, do you hear us?
Here there was okay. Okay, now should not be deactivated. Can you try to speak, please?
Can you hear us? Hello, Professor.
Hello, ma'am.
Okay. Can you say something?
Hello, ma'am.
They are speaking, but I cannot hear them anyway. Why? Why?
Prof, provi a accendere le casse dall'interruttore.
Maybe you can, yeah.
They are speaking. The volume of the speakers is too low. No, it's a maximum volume. Mm. Try again, please.
Hello, Professor.
Oh,
Congrats.
I don't know what I'm really sorry. Probably the professor that lectured before me was muted all the.
Only slides were stopped for us during the class, Professor.
So you didn't see anything.
No.
Well, that doesn't matter. Did you see the temple, the Greek temple of the Maastricht Treaty?
No, ma'am.
No,
We
huh?
only saw the timeline with the dates and the treaties.
Okay, what about
We are in the slide number 7.
now?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, now we can see.
Yeah, okay, that is the, maybe take a picture of this one, but you have these slides on Moodle, so you will find them. Anyway.
Ma'am, what about the previous questions that we have?
Yeah, let's go back to the chat. Yeah, can you repeat the questions? Because now I should have to read a lot of, what are the questions?
The first question, ma'am, about the taxation.
So?
As you said that there is a free movement inside the common markets, means the common markets within the EU members countries, right? So what is the protocol of the taxation? The first question.
The taxation, internal taxation. So internal taxation is competence of the member states, also on goods, but it must not be discriminatory. So member states may introduce internal taxation on goods, provided that it is the same for domestic and imported products. No taxation can be required to goods at the border crossing. Okay.
Okay, ma'am. And second question is, who is representing, the member countries in the EU? Like foreign ministers or presidents, who is the representing?
Who is representing this, I will explain you when I will speak about the institutions, because external representation is a role that is shared by the President of the European Council, the Commission, the President of the Commission, the High Representative. So you have to know these institutions, and I will go back to that problem later.
Okay, ma'am. Last question about the Schengen Treaty Agreement. Like what is the difference between the Schengen members and European Union members? Are they same or they are different?
They are different, meaning that the members of the Schengen area are all members of the Union, of course, because it is something that is part of the Union, but not all the members of the European Union are also members of the Schengen area.
Okay, ma'am, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I have a question too.
Yes, please.
It's regarding of the pillars you talked about before, and you mentioned there was a problem, and that's why they created the enhanced cooperation, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, so the problem
What was the problem itself?
So the problem was that on the one hand, there were the perspective of accession of a large number of members that may provoke the dilution of integration, because it was more difficult for the member states to find the necessary majorities in order to start new policies, or any way to start a new legislation in the framework of existing policies. This is one of the problems. And the other problem was that there was a fragmentation in the structure of the European Union. So the big problem was precisely this one. So this structure, which was complicated, which made it difficult for those inside and those outside the European Union to exactly know all the procedures and the role and the regime of the different sectors of cooperation and of integration, because consider that these three pillars were separated with different regimes, different decision-making processes, but at the same time that there were overlaps, no, between one and the other, because it is impossible to have political areas that are completely separated. And with the foreign policy, this was really evident. You cannot say, for example, that trade has not also political significance. No? So there were continuously overlaps and problems in the procedures to follow, the roles, the effect of the measures, and so on and so forth. And the Court of Justice started to be over and over again invested with decisions regarding the relationship between the three pillars. So there were a lot of problems in the implementation of this of the Maastricht Treaty. So the need for further reform. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Other questions? Here? Okay, now you have to remind me every day we have class that I have to check all the the situation here. I have to check the projector. I have to check the setting of the chat, and so I apologize, but I promise I will learn all this.
Sure,
so, yes.
Appreciate it, ma'am. We got distracted today.
Yeah. Okay. So see you next week. I will follow up on the